Let's now move to our second topic, which is listeners in Java Enterprise Edition. Here we'll talk about events in the servlet API, event class in the servlet API, and event listener interface. Let's start with events in the servlet API. Change in the state of an object is known as an event, which occurs during the life cycle of an object. There are important events related to a web application and servlets which are handled by event listener. To be notified of events, a custom class that implements the correct listener interface needs to be coded, and the listener class needs to be deployed via web.xml. The event class servlet APIs consists the following set of classes and interactions with them. So we have the servlet request event, the context event, the request attribute event, and so forth. Listeners are objects that notify whenever any event occurs. They contain event processing logic. The listener interfaces in servlet APIs are as follows: servlet request listener, servlet context listener, servlet request attribute listener, servlet context attribute listener, HTTP session listener, HTTP session attribute listener, HTTP session binding listener. The first one, the servlet request listener, handles servlet request event. It notifies when servlet container is initialized and destroys request object. The servlet container generates servlet request event, which it creates and destroys servlet request object. You have the request initialized and the request destroyed methods available. Then comes the servlet context listener. It handles and processes servlet context event. It receives notification when the servlet container creates or destroys context object. Again, two methods available. Next is the servlet request attribute listener. It receives a notification of the servlet request attribute event. It is used to find out when an attribute has been removed, added, or replaced from the request object. So we have the attribute event, which receives a notification that attribute has been added. The attribute removed function, which is called when a notification is triggered that an attribute has been removed, and then if an attribute has been replaced. Next we have the servlet context attribute listener. It receives and processes servlet context attribute event. Again, you have a attribute added, removed, and replaced method that responds to relevant notifications based on updates for the attributes in servlet context. Then we have HTTP session listener. It receives and processes HTTP session events. This listener is used to find out total active users. You have a session created and a session destroyed, which receives notification that a session has been created and subsequently invalidated. Next we have a session attribute listener. It handles and processes HTTP session binding event. It is used to find out when an attribute has been added or replaced from the session. So here we have attribute added event that responds to a notification, removed and replaced. Then we have the HTTP session binding listener. It handles and processes HTTP session binding event. It notifies when the object of the class has been added or removed from the session. So here we have the value bound method, which notifies the object that it has been bound to a session and identifies the session, and a value unbound. It notifies the object that it is being bound from a session and identifies the session. The last is the HTTP session activation listener. It receives a notification of HTTP session event. It notifies when the session migrates from one JVM to another. The methods session did activate, which notifies that the session has been activated. Session will passivate, which notifies that the session is about to be passivated. Application events provide notifications of a change in state of the servlet context. Each web application uses its own servlet context or of an HTTP session object. Servlet listener configuration. @WebListener annotation is used to declare a class as a listener. However, the class should implement one of or more of the listener interfaces. And then in the deployment descriptor web.xml file, this is how you would go and register the listener in the configuration. Let's look at a demo. that demonstrates implementing the listener interface to do event handling and handle events. We'll go to Eclipse. Let's close this, and we'll quickly summarize what we discussed and what we are going to attempt in this demo. Now, listeners listen for various events happening within our application. Events are associated with three different scopes: session, application, and request. When there are lifecycle changes for these scopes, an event can be triggered. For example, a session is created or a session is destroyed. And the practical usage of this is they can be used for auditing, like if we need to create a logging framework which will log to a file or log at a central location when the user logs in and user credentials are accordingly trapped. So we can maintain an audit trail. Whenever some attribute changes within these scopes, so if you have stored some attribute or information within the scope and that value changes or is updated, the event can be triggered. So the events triggered would be when you add, update, or replace an attribute value. For example, you cannot have multiple simultaneous logins when you log into your net banking account. The moment you log in, the information is stored in the session or some persistent media saying that this login ID has logged in, and that is tracked. The moment you try to log in again with the same ID, it will give you a message saying that this user is already logged in and does not have a option to log in again since the active session is already in progress. So let's take a small example and see how this works. We'll create a new dynamic web project. Let's call it listener demo. We'll select the version as 2.5. We'll go next and finish. We'll create a new package. Rename it to com. We'll add a new servlet inside the package, and we'll call it test servlet. Again, we'll select the service method and say finish. Let's come to the service method. Here we'll create an HTTP session object equal to request dot get session. So we create a new session. We'll create a system.out.println where we'll just log a message which says session created, listener will be invoked. Now we will add some data. Let's say username, and we'll give a value as Tom, and we'll also set another value in the session and name it as Jerry. We print another message which says session attributes displayed, and we'll just say listener to come here. Okay, so the second message. And then let's also let's update the username attribute, so we can have that update event, modified event, and we'll replace this value with Jim instead of Tom. Okay, let me add one more print statement, and here we'll say attribute modified listener will be invoked. Finally, we will invalidate the session so that the session is destroyed, and we simply print a message saying session destroyed. Now, as a best practice, we'll add a new package. We'll call this as listeners. Within the listeners package, we'll now add a new listener that will listen for events. We'll name this my listener. We are interested in the lifecycle events of the HTTP session object and changes to attributes inside the HTTP session object. Lifecycle events would mean when is the session created. Changes to attributes mean when we update or add the username and password field. So we'll say next and finish. So in the listener, it will actually add event handlers for session created, destroyed, attribute added, removed, and replaced. This is what got added as part of the listener. So let's go to the session created first. Here, let's print hello from listener session created at and we'll say new date argument. So dot get session dot get creation time. So this will allow me to trap. Let me add the package java.util for the date class, and that's it. So we just copy this, we go to session destroyed and we say session destroyed. Finally, we go to attribute added, we paste here and we'll say from listener key with plus arguments of 0 dot get name. So we'll get the name of the key plus and value is plus arguments of 0, which is a parameter that is passed to this event. So we will be able to do an audit trail as discussed and trap the value, and then we'll just add it successfully. So this is an event which will trigger when we add or we remove an attribute. So I'll just put this to the attribute added, and in the attribute removed we'll say removed successfully. Finally, the attribute replaced, if we replace or update the value, and we'll make this modified successfully. Okay, so let's go to the test servlet. We'll save all of the information. We'll use a control F11 to run. We'll remove the session and keep the listener demo published on Tomcat. Restart the server. And here you see hello from listener session created. This is the first message that came in with the date time, right? Now if you go to the listener, you will see this was the session that got created, hello from listener session created. And if you go to the test servlet, this is where we created the new session. Then session created, listener will be invoked. So this is the output. The moment we set attribute username and password, it trapped that in the audit trail and it said listener key with username and value Tom and password value Jerry is stored. So if you go to the listener, you can see that the attribute added was triggered and the added successfully got print. After that, session attributes displayed, listener to come here. So back to the servlet, this is the message that got printed. Then we updated username. So the modified successfully event actually triggered inside the listener. Attribute modified, listener will be invoked here. We invalidated. Moment we invalidated, the session destroyed triggered. So if you go to the listener, you see the session destroyed triggered. And finally, the removed happened because the session is invalidated. So the data from the session actually got removed. And lastly, the session got destroyed. So the session destroyed. So this explains the complete flow of how we were actually able to respond to events using the listener, and the events triggered in the right sequence based on whether we were creating the session, adding values or updating values that we stored in the session. And this really helps from an audit trail perspective. If you want to log whether the user is logged in, you want to check what are the credentials of the current user that is logged in. And if you look at the web XML or the deployment descriptor file, you will see that Eclipse automatically configured the listener for you in the config file without us having to really do anything. So that completes our demo in terms of the listener events that we implemented on top of the servlet.